Hello and welcome to the very first episode of LawWiser On Air. This is our brand new podcast series where we explore the intersection of law, business, and strategy and bring you insights straight from the top legal minds in the country. I'm your host, Alokita Tangri, and we're kicking things off with a topic that's gaining significant momentum that is corporate redomiciliation to India. Now, before we dive into the conversation, let's set the stage with a quick explainer for the audience. So, corporate redomiciliation is the process where a company moves its legal domicile or place of incorporation from one jurisdiction to another while maintaining its legal identity. Essentially, the company changes its country of incorporation without dissolving and reincorporating, effectively transferring its corporate citizenship. This trend is picking up pace in India as many companies originally incorporated overseas are now choosing to rebase in India. Why? To access Indian capital markets, simplify corporate structures, and streamline regulatory and tax compliance. Firms are using models like reverse mergers, share swaps, and liquidation to shift base. Each structure comes with its own complexities and opportunities, and that's what we're unpacking today. To help us do that, I'm joined by two great legal minds. We have Satyajit Gupta, Vice President and Head of Legal at EXL India, and Vaibhav Kakkar, Senior Partner at Saraf and Partners. Great to have both of you here. So let's begin with the bigger picture. Uh, Satyajit sir, my first question is to you. So, what are the key commercial or strategic reasons driving companies to consider redomiciling to India today?
I think this is a great topic you picked up. Of course, there are a lot of people writing about it as well, and I think great of Lawwiser first of all to invite me onto the first podcast. I would say, and again, without taking too much time, but just remind people that look, in the past, people were looking to incorporate and set up companies outside India, right? So I think that was done to take advantage of jurisdictions which were giving easy access to capital, which was allowing for tax optimization, maybe easier regulatory framework, access to markets, etc. And of course, the standard one of protection of IP, etc. Uh, Now I think the trend is the other way around, and I think, of course, while regulation now permitted, but definitely the growth story that is India, I think would probably be my top reason for companies to do it, because now you have great markets here, you've got the in terms of access to capital, various other elements which were prompting businesses to go outside India are now similarly coming back to India. And of course, as I'm sure Weber will talk about, the law and regulations also permit this.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, sir, for that. So now, Weber, sir, um, what are the major regulatory or legal hurdles in the redomiciliation process? And where do most companies get stuck?
Yeah. Um, thanks for having me over this show. And once again, I think it's an absolutely relevant theme and topic that you've chosen. It's very topical. We are seeing every second day structures of this kind right now being considered or being implemented. And it's a pleasure to be on this show and be co-paneling with Satyajit. Just to sort of lay out a little bit of context and a little bit of background before I come to some of the complexities and the challenges. As Satyajit very rightly pointed it out, that since the very beginning, typically Indian companies, as in when they wanted to access international capital, there was a strong preference from overseas investors, particularly, especially in the startup world, the Y Combinators and those kind of folks that set up a US holdco. We will invest in that US holding company. And then you raise all your money at the US holding company level. And the Indian subsidiary and the operations at the India level are done through an wholly owned subsidiary or through an Indian subsidiary. And by having an international holding company, access to capital is easier. Nobody's taking any dollar risk. All the pennies are being accounted for only in dollar terms, so there's no fluctuation on account of exchange control issues. And apart from that, also the fact that ultimately, if there has to be an exit given to those investors, it's easier to do a listing in global markets and markets such as the AIM market, London Stock Exchange, US markets, Hong Kong, Singapore. So that was the whole background in which a lot of international investors were forcing startups and entrepreneurs to literally look at having their holding companies at overseas jurisdictions. And that is how the structures were built over a period of time. I think what has happened over the last few years post COVID has essentially been three, four key trends that have really made this into become what people now perceive or call very popularly as ghar wapsi of sorts, of corporations from overseas coming back into India. And what really has happened is that the Indian capital markets have boomed. I think post COVID, people didn't really know where to invest their money. And there was obviously a lot of profit being booked. Remember, incomes went down, but margins of corporate India went up because the cost went down. And in that time period, of course, lot of money got invested in the Indian capital markets. The Indian capital markets saw a significant boom. There used to be a very strong apprehension that, particularly in the technology world or the space of e-commerce and other technology-driven businesses, Indian investors will not appreciate the future path of goal of profit. For instance, Amazon for the longest time had not broken even. So there was a very strong view that similarly, Indian investors do not have an appetite for tech plays which are based on technology development and growth, and where future might look very positive, but on day one they have wafer thin margins or burning cash. These models will not be appreciated in the Indian market. Used to be a perception. I think the IPO of companies such as Zomato and then subsequently Paytm, and of course Paytm's had a bit of a fair swing both sides, but that sort of led to a fill-up and confidence that there is an appetite for technology driven stocks in the Indian country as well, in India as well, where for investors will now no longer punish companies, at least on day one, for lack of profitability, provided they have a future profitability path. As long as there's a path to profitability, Indian investors will encourage those companies. So that phenomenon, along with the fact that Indian investors were putting in a lot of money, Indian citizens were putting in a lot of money in the Indian capital market, just meant that the Indian capital markets really, became the darling for the investor community. And corporates, which were already set up with their holdcos overseas, with their holding companies overseas, then had to seriously do a U-turn and rethink of coming back into India. And that obviously brings in a lot of challenges, because when you are or you're bringing back the holding company into India, you have to look at maybe doing a cross-border merger. You may also be required to look at the tax issues. And as you very rightly pointed it out, a number of companies as we speak, Pine Labs is a classic example, Zepto. Zepto is one company where a holding company had been set up in Singapore, but then they reverse merged it back into India. Meesho's almost there, as I'm sure you're aware that even for that matter, large payments companies as well, our online payments companies have also done a reverse merger where they're bringing back the holding company into India. I think obviously kudos to firstly the SEBI to have encouraged the Indian capital markets to grow in a particular way that has made this possible, that there's a ghar wapsi of sorts happening where promoters, entrepreneurs, institutional investors all want to be part of the Indian growth pie, the Indian capital market growth pie. And I think that's driving this entire change. And of course, I think there have been a bunch of legal changes, maybe which I can talk about later, which has also made it a lot easier for companies to go about doing so. By the way, the company's name is Razorpay. Razorpay has also done a cross-border merger of sorts, and which came out recently in newspapers. So that's my initial sort of reaction to your question.
It's very interesting how you've put it, Ghar Wapsi, and how the market is really booming. Now, to follow up on that, sir, Vaibhav sir, could you walk us through the common structures used for redomiciliation, like reverse merger, share swaps, or liquidation, and when each makes sense the most?
Right. So I think the two options that are usually prevalent is either a cross-border merger, where the holding company at which the investors have invested. So, for instance, if it was, let's assume it's Misho or for that matter Zepto, their holding companies in Singapore or the United States and where investors have put come in, that holding company will then merge at the India level into the Indian company, into the operating company, and all the shareholders of the transferor company, which is the holding company, will directly become the shareholders of the transferee company. Now, I must tell you that often the Indian regulators and government of India gets a lot of brickbats for not having reformed in time, having created too many complications. But this is one space where kudos to the government. I think kudos to the regulator as well. India is not convertible in capital accounts, so exchange control rules are fairly stringent. But the RBI did come up with a very robust cross-border merger regime, and so did the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. And and that entire cross-border regime could have been one where a lot of approvals could have been required. But the Reserve Bank of India was very liberal, very pragmatic, full marks to them. So in their regulations, they talk of an automatic approval for cross-border merger, where they say that if the criteria of the holding company in the Indian operating company is met and you take all your NCLT approvals, the holding company can merge into the Indian company without any challenge or complication. And so Companies Act of 2013 enabled all of these cross-border mergers to happen. In all fairness, merger of foreign companies into Indian companies was always possible under the 56 Act. It was the reverse that was not possible. The cross-border merger framework under the Companies Act enabled it, followed by the Reserve Bank of India rules, and of course the Ministry of Corporate Affairs rules. And Alankrita, what is very important to also note is that the government has not just went ahead and sort of clarified the position vis-a-vis cross-border mergers of any company, but they went one step further. They realized that cross-border merger of holding company and wholly owned subsidiaries is going to happen for this Ghar Wapsi to happen. So they've come up with an easier enabling framework where you don't even need to approach the National Company Law Tribunal if it's a merger of a holding company and its wholly owned subsidiary, and with approval of the regional director of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs of the registered office where the company is located, the merger can happen in record time. And that is what the enabling framework the government has come up with, which has enabled a cross-border mergers to happen. The second option, of course, is share swap. As you're aware, or as you may be aware, that I was involved in the acquisition by Zomato of Blinkit, which was earlier known as Grofers. And Grofers holding company was in Singapore. This is all matter of public domain, which I'm sharing with you. And there, essentially, all the shareholders of Grofers, which included institutional investors and private equity investors, they all came down to India level by way of a share swap, where they sold the shares to a company called Zomato, and Zomato, in consideration, issued its own shares. And through that share swap mechanism, the holding company and its shareholders, which was sitting at Singapore, now were owned at the India level. And Zomato, as a listed company, acquired the shares of the Indian operating company from the Singapore company, and in return gave the Singapore company shareholders its own shares by way of a share issuance. So these swaps or cross-border mergers are the way and mechanism to do it. I think once again, at the cost of repeating myself, the regulations, the regime has become far more transparent than before. But the biggest complication in these structures is not really regulations at the moment, it's more tax, because when a cross-border merger takes place, huge amount of tax implications can arise. And that's something where the tax advisors need to come in and evaluate the cost of doing that and do a cost benefit analysis.
Okay, very interesting. And it's good to know that at least the legal process has been really streamlined. So now, Satyajit sir, Vaibhav sir has already talked about how the process has been streamlined. To add to it, how do you view this trend from a legal strategy point? And are you seeing more conversations around this at the board or investor level?
Right. So thanks so much. And I think Weber has given some excellent examples. And I think another one for the share swap one would be PhonePe. I think PhonePe also did a similar one.
Right.
And one more, I think,
Credit
route
be
people have
also.
used is a, sorry,
Credit.
Credit B perhaps. Credit B, I'm not sure. I think Credit, there was, I don't know, there's another route which is liquidation. I think so liquidate and the shareholders get the Indian shares. I think there are a bunch of different ways, but I think Weber has made an excellent point that look, ultimately it's not only regulatory, but there could be tax consequences and there could be other consequences. So from a strategic perspective, you need to see. I mean, obviously, I think we spoke about what sort of encourages companies to look at redomiciling, but I think there are other elements also, in terms of where will you find the relevant, workforce, where will you find the relevant talent for this kind of work. Of course, now there's a global, fight for talent around the world, so maybe that could encourage companies to look at it. Uh, you have to also look at, amongst many things, how do you manage this entire transition, right? You are sort of moving an entire uh, structure, company, brand from probably one jurisdiction to another. So I think lots of practical elements to look at, and I think companies and as Weber very rightly mentioned, he mentioned examples of I think Pine Labs, etc. And we've seen with Pine Labs, I think they domiciled to Singapore to I think list access foreign markets, but then the foreign markets tanked, so then everything slowed down. Somebody called me and said, we need a GC to run an IPO outside. I said, no way, please, that will take years of my life. But I think, and definitely redomiciling, and of course, with a intention then to access probably capital markets or access benefits, incentives, or sort of things, is something which needs careful thought. Uh, just as by way of background, my company, the company I was in, actually was again has a very strange connection to Weber because it was set up by Luthra. So I think Mr.
That's
Ajit
right.
Luthra was our first subscribers. So interestingly, it was initially set up in India, domiciled in India, used to have offices in Barakamba Road, Ashok Estate, and then we actually domiciled to the US because I mean, partially to raise capital, but partially also because our clients are out there. So a US bank or a US insurance company will think 100 times before using an Indian company, even now, possibly. But then when it comes through a company which has an office on Park Avenue, they're fine with that, right? So I think there are a lot of other things, elements to look at as well. But I think definitely the conversations, to answer your question, the conversations at the board, investor levels are definitely happening. And I think that's why you're seeing so many cases of, this cropping up, and there are, umpteen articles being written about it. Lawyers are speaking about it. Conference sessions will, I'm sure, focus on this as well. So it's an interesting topic to look at. And I think, and one great point which Weber has made is that the Indian government's been extremely helpful, supportive, and I think has, many places just removed any any possibility of there being red tape by clearing, these matters through. So definitely a great trend and development. But just as a word of caution, I don't think it's for everybody, right? So you just have to look out whether it's really for you or not.
So, like when you say that you need to look out, so you've clearly told us the key questions that go in the discussion when we're considering redomiciliation. And what particularly, what concerns would come to your mind at the top of your head, when we talk about redomiciliation, when an in-house counsel is discussing it with the team?
Sure. So I think, look, some of these I may have mentioned, so at the cost of again repeating myself, I would say that obviously look at, what are you planning to achieve out of it, right? So obviously, if you're looking to access capital, if you're looking to enter a market, look at the potential of the market, and look at a medium to long term plan. Don't just think of a short term plan. Like we saw these examples of people domiciling and then having to bring the domicile back. even those elements and those exercises, are expensive. People actually set up entire teams for this exercise. Obviously, the law firms engage, tax advisors engage. So I think it's not a exercise to be taken up in a, just a brush. So obviously, look at those elements. Look at definitely, I think, the point that was made about the tax consequences. Think of it again, medium to long term. Don't just think of today. And thirdly, I think from a business perspective, look at, how will you manage the change, right? I mean, you may have to move people, you may have to, is the right talent available in that market where you're moving to, or you just, just moving purely for access to capital? Will you be able to, sort of, uh, how about your clients? What is going to be the impact on clients? So I think there are lots of areas that you can, obviously, you can research, you can do some dipstick surveys, you can figure out what works and what doesn't. But you need to, I mean, just one consideration of just pure access to capital or purely tax benefit or getting access to market will not, you know, sort of decide this for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, Vaibhav sir, could you tell us about some of these sectors or types of companies that are mostly right now actively exploring redomiciliation to India?
Alokita, I think this will be as a consideration for almost all companies which are looking at raising growth capital. I mean, these days, typically after a lot of uh, Indian companies have done a ghar wapsi of sorts with redomiciliation of their holding companies back into India, and after having paid significant tax for doing so, a lot of Indian companies are reaching out to us as and when they're setting up the platform and the structure on day one, asking us that should we have our structure in India or should we have a structure at the old co level? Because we don't want to make the mistake of structuring ourselves at a holdco at US or in Singapore, and then 5 years later, when the business becomes valuable and attractive, pay huge amount of taxes for no reason. So that is causing a lot of Indian entrepreneurs to think very carefully at the time of setting up of the business that where their holding company should be. One word of caution for all the viewers: it's not legally permissible as such for a resident Indian to have a overseas holding company. There are a lot of complications from an exchange control law standpoint for a resident Indian individual who's a founder of a business at the India level to have a overseas holding company level. But suffice it is to say that there are some structures available in the market, and for paucity of time, I perhaps may not be appropriate for me to get into that degree of detailing. But let's assume for whatever legally compliant mechanisms, there is a way and means for a resident Indian to set up an overseas holding company. Then in that situation, the key determining factor really becomes where should they set it up? Should it be in US? Should it be in Singapore? Or actually not have a holding company there and just run your operations at the India level? I can anecdotally share with you an experience where there's somebody who I'm advising and supporting in the defense sector who is, as a company, is a subcontractor for some of the large US majors and the US major defense OEMs, and they are a tier two subcontractor and now a tier one subcontractor. And one of the questions that they had was that I'm running this business out of the US. I have an Indian subsidiary that's supporting my business, but do you think I should reverse flip it and have my holding company at the India level? Because tomorrow, if I have to give exit to all my investors, I'm hearing Indian markets are perhaps the most exciting markets. The highest multiple that is given to businesses is in India, and so on and so forth. So can you imagine the broad change in the spectrum from what I told you at the very beginning to where US headquartered businesses are saying, should I reverse flip myself with a holding company in India because I'll get a better multiple in future whenever I try and give exit to my investors and list my company and list my business. So at the time of structuring itself, a lot of entrepreneurs are very savvy these days, and I think that's the evaluation they are doing. I mean, for a defense supplier, maybe the benefit of being in the United States and the ability to get that acceptability from their OEM partners, as Satyajit very rightly mentioned, that when you're catering to global investors and global corporates, sometimes physical presence on ground gives them a lot higher degree of comfort. So maybe for an Indian company or an Indian entrepreneur who's based his business in the US, perhaps it may not be worthwhile to re-domicile into India. But can you imagine the broad change of spectrum where he's actually evaluating that because of the attractiveness of the Indian markets? So I think it's not really a sector-driven analysis, but I think any and everybody who's setting up their businesses are now carefully evaluating where they should be basing their entire structure of the business from, because it could have adverse implications if you don't plan it well from the beginning.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. Now I'll just throw the last question to both of you, even though you have already talked about, covered pretty much everything, but still, what advice would each of you give to early stage founders or CXOs who are considering redomiciliation in the next 1 or 2 years?
Sure. So I think, look, some of it may have already come up, and I know uh, you want to keep your podcast short, but I mean, basically just say that, look, I mean, the important thing is to do a full scale cost benefit analysis. I think you need to look at whether a particular structure will work for you long term. Don't just think short term and expose yourself to cost and expenses, and then you have to move back and do various other things. So think of it long term. Think of don't just go by one element. Again, try to look at the various elements that we spoke about, whether it's tax, whether it's access to market, capital, where are your clients, where's the talent, where all of those. And finally, I think do engage reputed advisors like Weber, and we do a plug for him. Come to Weber, come to a good tax advisor. Don't just do these decisions based on, again, I would say Gen AI, because I think sometimes, and these are big life-changing decisions for a corporate. Typically, things like reverse merger, flip, etc. Companies tend to do it once or twice in its life, at least what we will see as its life cycle. So I think just even if you are early on in your journey, just think of it long term, because you will have to the intention is to be able to make a sustainable business out of it.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. Web sir, anything you would like to add?
No, I think everything's been covered, and thank you, Satyajit, for your kind words. And more importantly, I couldn't agree with you more. These are very, very difficult and important decisions that corporates and businesses have to make when they choose their domicile, and then when they're looking at re-domiciling themselves from one jurisdiction to the other. It's not just the regulatory part of it, it's the tax, as Satyajit mentioned, it's the employees, it's your interface with your customers, where your customers are located, how they would react. All of those are key aspects and considerations to be made. These reverse mergers are more relevant where people had set up holding companies outside. All businesses being run in India, their values in India, just for certain optimum leverage purposes. These companies had their holding companies overseas, and now you're seeing a ghar wapsi of sorts. But for general businesses to look at redomiciliation is an important decision to be made, a life-changing one at that. And so all aspects have to be very carefully considered. And my one last sort of word here really would be that through this platform and various other platforms that I end up participating, my sincere request to the government of India is that they've set themselves on a path of reform. A lot of reforms have taken place, and full marks to them for doing so. But I think there's still a lot that is yet to be achieved. For instance, I for one, don't really appreciate why, in the Indian context, National Company Law Tribunal has to work in a particular way that they are. I think they're just saddled with so many IBC cases that the whole purpose of having NCLT as a separate tribunal to facilitate mergers has somewhat gotten compromised. So while companies such as, I know for a fact that Zepto was able to do its cross-border merger in 3 months, but I know several other companies that are stuck with the NCLT. And just that NCLT is just saddled with IBC cases, so they've not really been able to look at these cases in a responsive manner. And so, with the greatest of respect for the judiciary, and I have utmost respect for them, but I just wish if the government could work in tandem with the judiciary to meet our business objectives. Ultimately, this country has to grow to be the one of the largest economies in the world, from fourth to third, and meaningfully compete with the first and the second. Then I think a lot of legal reforms need to happen, not just in the law books, but how in practice things are done. And I think a better coordinated approach between the government and the judiciary would be really, really helpful in that direction.
Thank you so much, sir, for that. And that wraps up our debut episode of LawWiser on Air. A big thank you to both of you for your time and insights.